According to sources close to the Federal Transport Oversight Commission, the event that paralyzed the Moscow-St. Petersburg land bridge was not the result of a simple malfunction. It was an attack, precise, calculated, and designed to send a message. In a single hour, the artery that carried nearly a quarter of the nation's industrial flow was severed, leaving trains stranded in silence and factories choking on stillness. The official version calls it a technical disruption caused by electrical failure. But those words now sound like a ritual, spoken to cover the fact that the country's most critical link has been shattered. It began just before dawn, when freight convoys left the southern terminal under heavy fog. Everything was routine, the same mechanical rhythm that had kept the industrial north alive for decades. Then, without warning, a single point of light appeared on the track, a flash so brief it was missed by most surveillance cameras. Within seconds, the power grid collapsed along the entire stretch between Klin and Tver. Engines died mid-transit. Control towers lost signal. A moment later, the first explosion ripped through the junction near Lykovo, tearing apart the rail bed and sending shockwaves through the steel like an echo of war. By the time emergency units arrived, the air smelled of ozone and burning copper. The rails had fused. The sleepers were scorched clean through. Engineers called it impossible. They'd seen derailments, collisions, fires, but never a line melted from within. Something had attacked the infrastructure itself, as though the current had turned against its own circuit. Within an hour, all communication between Moscow's dispatch centers and the industrial zones near St. Petersburg went dark. Entire grids flickered, then vanished. At first, the silence seemed procedural, an information lockdown, the kind that follows every major incident. But inside the Ministry of Industry, according to a senior advisor who spoke on condition of anonymity, chaos erupted. They didn't understand what was failing, he said. The network was reacting as if it were alive. Autonomous systems began shutting themselves down without command, rerouting data, locking access points, erasing logs. It was as if the infrastructure had sensed intrusion and sealed itself off, not to protect, but to hide. By midday, the blackout had reached beyond logistics. The Moscow industrial belt began reporting cascading failures, conveyor belts halted, assembly lines froze, and automated transport vehicles stood motionless. For the first time since its creation, the so-called Factory Front Express, the direct supply chain feeding military and civil production between the two capitals, stopped entirely. Every minute of silence cost millions. But what worried officials most wasn't the money, it was the precision. Whoever had done this knew the network intimately. Official statements framed it as a localized breakdown. Yet the evidence pointed elsewhere. Security analysts studying the recovered control modules found traces of a remote intrusion, commands written in a language none of the internal engineers recognized. Not code in the conventional sense, but signals, oscillating bursts injected directly into the current. They bypassed all firewalls, all encryptions, all failsafes. It's as if it spoke directly to the system's nervous system, one specialist said. It didn't break in, it was invited. The phrase began circulating in internal memos, the infrastructure turned inward. A poetic way of saying that the system had been used against itself. For a country built on vertical control, such an idea borders on blasphemy. And yet, it fits the pattern. In the hours after the attack, the Ministry of Digital Development quietly ordered the isolation of all major logistics databases. Civilian traffic was rerouted, personal devices along the transport corridor were forced into offline mode, and drones patrolling the area were recalled. The land bridge had vanished from the digital map. Meanwhile, on the ground, witnesses described the aftermath in fragments. Train engineers spoke of compasses spinning as if magnetized, of metallic dust clinging to the air, of the faint hum that followed the explosion, a tone that made radios crackle but carried no message. It wasn't sound, one operator said. It was pressure. Like the air itself was listening. What made the situation even stranger was the total absence of debris that could explain the blast. No shrapnel, no explosive residue, no chemical traces. The rails weren't broken, they were reshaped. As if a pulse of energy had folded the metal, erasing the evidence of its own origin. The few photographs that escaped censorship showed a landscape both familiar and wrong, tracks ending mid-motion, steel frozen in curves that defied geometry. Within hours, rumors began to circulate in the corridors of Moscow's ministries. Some spoke of a cyber attack, others of an experimental defense mechanism misfiring. But the most disturbing whispers came from those who'd seen the encrypted field reports, the ones never meant for civilian eyes. They suggested that the blast had come not from below, but from above. A short, focused discharge, invisible, precise, surgical. The kind that leaves no crater, only silence. By evening, both Moscow and St. Petersburg had entered what officials termed temporary logistical stabilization. In practice, it meant paralysis. Freight convoys were halted, factory deliveries postponed, and the movement of raw materials suspended. The bridge between the two industrial hearts was gone, not destroyed in flames, but erased by precision. A gap in space where movement once lived. And while the government insists it's rebuilding, insiders know the truth: the land bridge cannot simply be repaired. Because what broke was not the track, but the illusion of control. A single coordinated strike exposed how fragile the system really is. One line cut, and the country stopped breathing. Tonight, the route between Moscow and St. Petersburg lies in darkness, its rails cold and silent beneath the frost. The trains that once carried the pulse of the nation now rest like empty veins. The question that hangs in the air is not how this happened, but who allowed it. And that question is far more dangerous than the explosion itself. Stay with us. What follows has already begun to unfold behind closed doors, and the answers, once spoken, may not remain online for long. Subscribe while the lights are still on. According to preliminary intelligence assessments circulating among defense consultants, the destruction of the Moscow-St. Petersburg land bridge was not simply an act of sabotage. It was a demonstration, a warning encoded in logistics, a strike aimed not at infrastructure but at the belief that infrastructure could be trusted. In a country where movement equals power, the paralysis of the main artery is more than disruption. It is exposure. Internal documents from the Federal Security Coordination Bureau, leaked in fragments to closed analytical networks, reveal that the first anomalies on the line were detected days before the explosion. They were small, almost invisible, irregular energy fluctuations, nanosecond delays in data transmission, unexplainable voltage echoes between substations. Engineers dismissed them as software instability. But in hindsight, those tremors were the countdown. Something, or someone, had already entered the system, mapping its rhythm, syncing with its pulse. The Moscow-St. Petersburg corridor was not just a railway, it was a neural spine. Every signal from the factories, every shipment order, every autonomous cargo command passed through its encrypted nodes. Whoever struck knew that disabling one relay would ripple through hundreds of dependent systems, shutting down production lines across the industrial north. It was elegance through simplicity: destroy the rhythm, and everything built upon it falls silent. Officially, investigators describe the incident as a cascading failure initiated by external interference. But the classified annex, the one meant for internal circulation only, uses a different phrase: sequential intelligence breach. That wording implies cognition, as if the event unfolded with awareness. Some in the analytical sector even speculate that the system itself may have been turned into an instrument, hijacked by code that understood how to hide within its host. Not a cyber attack in the traditional sense, but an infiltration that redefined the boundary between command and sabotage. Cybersecurity experts who examined the residual data speak of an impossible phenomenon: control codes rewriting themselves during transmission. We saw commands that we never sent, one technician confessed under anonymity. They looked like ours, they carried our signatures, but the logic was reversed. It was as if someone used our own language against us. In closed briefings, this phenomenon is now called mirror logic. It is through mirror logic that the system was made to destroy itself. At precisely 4:32 that morning, the command to synchronize grid output was issued. Normally, that instruction aligns energy flows between power substations, harmless, routine. But this version contained a microscopic alteration, one decimal, one interval, just enough to cause every grid to feed back upon itself. The result was catastrophic symmetry: each station amplified the other, creating a loop of pure current that melted the network from the inside. The line wasn't attacked. It was convinced to collapse. Such precision requires not only technological mastery but access, deep, internal access. Which is why, behind closed doors, investigators have stopped looking outward. Instead, they're searching inward, tracing every authorization, every encrypted session, every administrator who ever touched the network. The word infiltration now carries two meanings, one digital, one human. Because systems don't betray themselves, people do. Within Moscow's ministries, the air has grown thick with paranoia. Technical directors are being replaced, project supervisors reassigned, security clearances suspended. Yet even as the bureaucracy reshuffles, a darker realization spreads: the attack exploited vulnerabilities that no outsider could have known. That means someone inside, perhaps unknowingly, helped design the mechanism of their own failure. The deeper analysts go, the more they encounter signs of deliberate concealment. Redundant firewalls rerouted, access trails erased, entire servers overwritten with white noise. It's as though someone anticipated the investigation and left behind a void in place of evidence. One intelligence officer described it bluntly: "It's not that we can't find the trace is erasing us." Amid this confusion, attention has turned to a facility known internally as Node 47, a relay hub located near Tver, officially listed as a maintenance station. Records show that 3 months before the explosion, Node 47 underwent an unscheduled software calibration supervised by a team that no one seems able to identify. Their credentials were valid, their signatures authentic, yet their identities correspond to no official personnel database. The visit lasted precisely 7 hours. After that, all logs were purged. That was the last known modification to the system before the collapse. It's in such details that patterns emerge. A visit without names. A code without origin. A command that rewrites itself. Each piece alone seems abstract, together, they form a portrait of intent. And that intent feels less like rebellion, and more like orchestration. Meanwhile, the country watches in uneasy quiet. The trains remain still, the factories half alive, the corridors of communication broken but not yet rebuilt. Supply chains once synchronized to the second now operate on instinct and fear. Every delay feels deliberate. Every silence feels loaded. Beyond the borders, observers have grown cautious. European monitoring centers detect abnormal data bursts along the corridor, faint electrical oscillations repeating at precise intervals. Analysts call them ghost signals. They shouldn't exist, yet they do. Some believe it's residual current, others suspect it's communication, the remnants of the bridge still trying to speak. In the corridors of Moscow's power ministries, the prevailing sentiment is unspoken but understood: this was not the work of vandals or foreign intelligence alone. This was a signal to those within, a message to the architects of the system that the system no longer belongs entirely to them. And that is why the silence now feels heavier than the loss itself. Because beneath that silence lies awareness that the bridge between Moscow and St. Petersburg was more than steel and current. It was trust. And trust, once burned, does not rebuild. Something new is taking shape in the vacuum, unseen, unnamed, unaligned. And as one insider admitted quietly, the network's not dead. It's listening. Whatever that means, it's the most dangerous sentence uttered in the capital since the night the lights went out. According to observers stationed along the corridor between Moscow and St. Petersburg, the quiet that followed the collapse feels unnatural, like a city holding its breath. Trains stand abandoned on their tracks, their engines cold, their windows reflecting nothing but the gray sky. The stations, once alive with the rhythm of departure and arrival, now echo with the sound of absence. You can walk for kilometers along the steel and not meet a single voice. Only wind, and the distant metallic groan of rails cooling in the frost. For the first time in years, there is no movement between the two capitals. The express that connected the country's brain and its heart is gone. Factories stand still, warehouses overflow with goods that can no longer move, and workers sit idle beside silent machines, watching the lights flicker on and off without purpose. In the north, raw materials wait to be shipped; in the south, production lines are starving. The chain is broken, and everyone knows it. But no one is allowed to say why. The government's briefings continue, sterile and identical. Progressive restoration of logistical stability, they repeat. Yet on the ground, people see a different picture. Supplies are delayed, shipments lost, communication spotty. The further one travels from the capital, the more distorted the official story becomes. Some say the rails are still radioactive, others that new lines are being built underground. There are even rumors that a temporary bypass has been completed, though no one has seen it, and no freight has ever passed through. In Moscow, the shutdown has changed the rhythm of life in invisible ways. Prices rise quietly. Transit corridors close without explanation. Whole districts near industrial zones are locked behind temporary access restrictions. On paper, these are safety measures. In reality, they're containment. The land bridge was more than a route, it was a signal of continuity, proof that the nation's core still connected to itself. Without it, everything feels distant, hesitant, fractured. Even the air seems different, heavier, slower, expectant. People sense it instinctively. In St. Petersburg, harbor workers whisper that the city has become an island again. In Moscow, truck drivers speak of convoys rerouted through forest roads under military escort. Communication between the two poles, once instant, now passes through coded channels, delayed, fragmented, stripped of detail. Everyone feels watched. Everyone suspects someone else. Social media tells another story, one that keeps being erased. Posts describing strange lights near the corridor vanish within minutes. Images of empty trains are flagged for sensitive content. Entire accounts disappear overnight. It's not only information that's being controlled, it's memory itself. What the public is allowed to remember is shrinking, replaced by silence. And in that silence, fear grows, not of what happened, but of what hasn't yet been said. Sociologists call it systemic disorientation. People call it stillness. Trains no longer run, and yet at night, residents near the old station swear they can hear them, phantom sounds of steel, rhythm, acceleration that fade into nothing. As if the system itself refuses to believe it's gone. A city learns to live with ghosts when truth becomes forbidden. And still, somewhere between Moscow's towers and Petersburg's harbors, the remains of the line hum faintly under the snow. Sensors detect current where there should be none, weak, pulsing, irregular, like a heartbeat trying to restart. Engineers dismiss it as static. But the locals, watching the horizon flicker in the night, say something else. It's the bridge remembering. Whether that's superstition or warning no longer matters. What matters is that the country feels split, not geographically, but spiritually. Two cities staring at each other across a silence they cannot cross. The land bridge was meant to unite. Now it divides, not by distance, but by fear. What's emerging in that gap is not recovery, but replacement. And as one quiet analyst whispered in a closed session, the next connection won't be made by rails. These words were quickly erased from the transcript, but not from memory. Because in this new stillness, even erased words find a way to echo. The bridge is gone, but something else is building in the silence. Subscribe now, not for news, but for what remains unspoken. According to documents circulating in closed analytical circles, the blackout between Moscow and St. Petersburg was not a failure of protection, but an execution of protocol. An insider operation, precise and absolute, designed to look like chaos. Evidence now suggests that the land bridge, that proud corridor of steel and energy, was intentionally taken offline to prevent something from moving through it. What that something was remains classified, but fragments of intercepted communication point toward one chilling phrase: containment priority. In the days leading to the collapse, several encrypted orders were transmitted from an internal network codenamed Relay 9. It was officially listed as a testing environment, a sandbox for simulation. But logs retrieved from private servers reveal that Relay 9 was connected directly to the real transport grid for exactly 14 minutes before the system went dark. 14 minutes. Enough to run a command sequence, enough to lock, reroute, and erase. What followed was the disappearance of that network from all registries. The terminal from which it operated was physically destroyed 2 days later during what was described as a scheduled fire suppression drill. The coincidence is perfect. Too perfect. Investigators now speak quietly of controlled internal demolition. The idea that those responsible for maintaining the system may have also been those who ended it. Not for power, but for secrecy. To hide a movement that should never have been tracked, or to erase the evidence of something already transported before the breach. In the corridors of Moscow's ministries, this possibility has replaced fear with dread. Because it means the enemy is not foreign. It means the bridge was not attacked, it was silenced. What was crossing that night? Some say it was a convoy carrying classified military hardware to the northern plants. Others whisper it was data, physical storage containing research linked to experimental propulsion or energy projects. But among the few who've seen the unredacted emergency logs, another term appears again and again: biosynthetic cargo. The documents give no further description. Yet even the wording itself is enough to unsettle. Biosynthetic cargo. Not equipment, not shipment. Cargo that required isolation, and when isolation failed, destruction. It explains, perhaps, why the response was so surgical. Why there was no visible blast crater, no random collateral damage. Why the line was melted, not broken, as if sterilized. Engineers say the effect resembles plasma containment, something capable of cleansing an entire structure without external detonation. That level of precision can only come from within the grid itself. The command had to be authorized by someone with national-level clearance. Someone who understood that once executed, it could never be undone. In the first hours after the collapse, internal communications show confusion at lower levels, engineers demanding to know why power relays were refusing to restart, regional directors asking for permission to override, messages marked urgent that received no response. Then, abruptly, the chain of command went silent. Those who tried to reconnect were locked out. When power finally returned, it was only to a fraction of the system, and all diagnostic data had been wiped clean. A system erasing its own memory, or being forced to forget. Inside the Ministry of Digital Development, the tone has shifted from denial to resignation. We are managing consequences, one senior analyst admitted in a private meeting. Not causes. The cause is gone. There are whispers that the servers responsible for the sequence were never physically located, that their signal came through a proxy buried in infrastructure built years ago, during the corridor's original expansion. Meaning the architecture itself was compromised long before the event. The bridge was built with its own undoing inside it. And now, the paranoia spreads beyond engineers and officials. Industrial leaders who once depended on the line now hold closed meetings in their offices, guarded and wordless. They know that production halts were not random. Some facilities lost connection seconds before the explosion, as though preemptively cut off. It's as if someone wanted the damage contained to specific sectors, silencing only those plants involved in something undisclosed. A pattern emerges, precision targeting disguised as infrastructure collapse. Outside, the population senses the change even if they don't understand it. The silence has turned into suspicion. The two capitals, once bound by steel, now watch each other across an invisible line. And in the middle, a corridor erased from maps, yet pulsing faintly with electronic residue, a phantom circuit that refuses to die. Somewhere in that no-man's land, military teams still patrol. Their orders are unclear, their presence unacknowledged. Night vision satellites catch faint flashes along the buried rail, not light, but heat. Controlled, rhythmic, deliberate. As if something is still being monitored. Or still moving. A high-level source in the logistics command described it in one sentence: it wasn't sabotage, it was quarantine. That statement, once spoken, was never repeated. The official line remains unchanged, restoration in progress. But inside every closed briefing, one unspoken truth hangs in the air: the bridge was shut down to keep something in, not to protect something out. And that realization changes everything. The fracture is no longer technical. It is psychological, political, human. Trust has dissolved, replaced by the cold logic of survival. And in that logic, one rule prevails: if a system can be turned against itself once, it can happen again. The question haunting every command room tonight is not who did it, but when it will happen next. Because every light in Moscow now flickers like a warning. And somewhere, far away, the dead rails of the north hum faintly, as if remembering the command that silenced them. By the time the first trains were cleared to move again, the country had already changed. No one announced it. No decree was signed, no borders redrawn, but the geography of power had shifted. The Moscow-St. Petersburg land bridge, once the physical embodiment of unity, now exists only in memory and simulation. Official maps show it as under restoration, yet everyone understands it will never return in its old form. What was broken was not infrastructure, but symmetry, the illusion that the two cities beat in unison. From the ministry's windows, the capital looks unchanged: lights, traffic, the constant pulse of a metropolis pretending to breathe normally. But beneath that surface, the data networks reroute through temporary channels, freight travels by shadow routes, and people whisper about the new line, an invisible corridor, encrypted, unmapped, built not of rails but of secrecy. Some believe it's already functioning, bypassing the old land bridge entirely. Others claim it's a myth created to soothe a restless population. Either way, the effect is the same: movement continues, but no one knows who controls it. Inside the industrial sectors, the atmosphere has thickened into something close to reverence. Workers no longer ask when production will resume, they ask whether it should. The silence of the line has become almost sacred, a reminder of how fragile everything was, how close to the edge the system had always been. Entire factories now operate at partial capacity, not because they must, but because they fear drawing too much attention. It's as if the nation has collectively learned to whisper. Yet beneath this surface calm lies a new reality taking shape. The government's communications emphasize restructuring, distributed resilience, multi-vector connectivity. But the translation is simple: decentralization. The empire of movement has dissolved into enclaves of self-preservation. Each region now guards its own current, its own silence, its own truth. The land bridge was once a line of connection, now it is a fault line, invisible, but deep. Whispers inside strategic circles speak of the northern isolation zone, a strip of land quietly reclassified as restricted. Military presence remains, though officially demobilized. Surveillance drones fly over it nightly, scanning for heat signatures that no one will explain. Some say they're monitoring residual magnetic anomalies, others suggest they're watching for return. Whatever they're searching for, it's something that refuses to stay buried. Sensors along the permafrost still register faint, pulsing patterns, not mechanical, not electrical, but rhythmic, like breathing under ice. Experts refuse to speculate publicly, but among themselves they admit, the corridor is not inert. Whether by accident or design, it has become something else, a conduit for energy, for data, perhaps even for communication of a kind we no longer understand. The system didn't die, one analyst said quietly. It adapted. And that adaptation now defines the country itself, fragmented, self-contained, quietly alive under a skin of silence. In Moscow, the phrase strategic quiet has entered official vocabulary. It means that stability is maintained not through openness, but through erasure. When the network flickers, when the power grid stutters, no one reports it anymore. They simply wait, listening, knowing that some things have learned to live beneath perception. The state has discovered a new form of control, not by preventing the unknown, but by absorbing it. And in St. Petersburg, where the rails once met the sea, the horizon has changed. The factories are dim, the ports slow, but at night the water glows faintly, a soft pulse rising from the depths, vanishing when approached. Fishermen call it the reflection of the bridge, as if the system itself were dreaming of its lost body. Officials dismiss it as optical illusion, but they too avoid the shore. So ends the story that began with a flash on the tracks, not in closure, but in transformation. The bridge that once united the two cities has disappeared, yet in its absence, a new geography has emerged, one of silence, secrecy, and invisible lines that cannot be seen but can be felt. The country now moves not across rails, but through shadows. Those who understand whisper that this was always the destination, that the bridge was never meant to last, only to evolve. It was the final test of control. Could a nation be reconnected without movement, governed without contact, united through the fear of disconnection? The answer, it seems, is yes. The lights are back on, but they illuminate a different map, one where the lines no longer mark distance, but boundaries of knowledge. And beyond those boundaries, something hums quietly, patient and awake. They call it recovery. But those who listen closely know the truth: the land bridge isn't gone. It's waiting. Stay with us, these records may vanish as quietly as the trains that once crossed the corridor. Subscribe now, while the silence still speaks. Because when it stops, you'll understand what the new map truly means.